Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the 2023 Interreligious Institute's LaCocque Interreligious Lecture and Schaalman Award. We are so thrilled that you are choosing to spend your time with us here this evening, and we are so very excited to introduce our guest to you. Before we do that, I want to just give a little bit of housekeeping, and I will pass it off to President Braxton. We do have a chat feature, and we would love for you to use the chat for responses, for questions as they arise, to say hello to people you might know. So we encourage you to open your chat and to use it throughout the evening. There will be a chance later on for Q&A and responses. And so if you have any, before we get there, feel free to utilize the chat for that. We also recognize that maybe you are not camera ready, but if you are and you wish to have your cameras on, we would love to see your faces. So we're more than just the black boxes. We do use this way of using Zoom so we can see people as well. So if you are willing to share your face, we would love to see you this evening. You are on mute, and we ask you to stay on mute unless, of course, you do engage in a Q&A towards the end, just to don't have any distractions, of course. So I think that is all the business that I have. And to do our full and proper welcome for the evening, I would be very proud to introduce the president of CTS, Dr. Brad Braxton.
Thank you, Kim. On behalf of the Board of Trustees and every member of the CTS family, I welcome you to the 2023 André LaCocque Interreligious Lecture. CTS is an audacious community. This is indeed one of our distinctive characteristics. For nearly 170 years, CTS has been on the vanguard of providing prophetic, progressive leadership for the social, cultural, and moral issues, challenges, and opportunities facing each generation. And we have done so not reluctantly, not fearfully, not timidly, but boldly, in the name of all that is sacred, and in the attempt to tangibilitate our progressive mission and commitments. CTS is boldly equipping leaders with the knowledge, skills, and values needed to refashion a world where religious and cultural difference is not a problem to be solved, but rather an opportunity to be embraced. Our annual LaCocque Lecture is a living, breathing manifestation of our bold belief that every life has dignity, as well as our bold belief in the inherent worth and dignity of the non-human partners and forces who cohabitate with us on this planet. Dr. Vesely-Flad, you honor us with your presence in this lecture. We are ready and willing for you to take us to higher heights and deeper depths as you offer your intellectual insight and moral foresight. Teach all you want this evening among us. We hear you gladly. Yes, in the spirit of gladness and anticipation, let us open our minds, hearts, and spirits to receive what has been prepared for us. And as a consequence of our being together, may all of us leave this gathering better people who are committed to co-creating a better world. I invite now Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva to offer reflections.
Thank you very much, Dr. Braxton. In that spirit of anticipation, we have several things we want to share with you before Dr. Vesely-Flad gets to speak, but we'll just keep anticipating how wonderful that will be. I've been asked to share a little bit of how we got here. It was 1966 when Dr. André LaCocque joined the faculty at CTS. He was already a renowned Hebrew Bible scholar, and he quickly launched a doctoral program in comparative religious studies to train a new generation of scholars who recognized that you can't understand early Christianity without understanding Judaism as well. And it helped to transform Christian theological education, not only here at CTS. Suddenly, people remembered that Jesus was an observant Jew, that his ideas grew out of vibrant, diverse communities of Jewish living and learning. And they began to grapple with polemical passages in the New Testament that sometimes sought to build up his community of followers by tearing down the competition. Dr. LaCocque, who was a child of the Shoah, whose family harbored Jews in Belgium, he never forgot how easy it is to use religion as a tool for division and demonization. Responding to the urgent and ongoing need to advance mutual respect and cooperation among and across religious difference, he also established a Center for Jewish Christian Studies, which coordinated a series of groundbreaking conferences. It was among the first to recognize the importance of including Islam in this conversation among the peoples of the book. And Dr. LaCocque also convened the first conference that was led by female Muslim scholars in the United States. The center broadened its reach, and it was renamed the Center for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies, JCIS. In the 1980s, Dr. LaCocque met another child of the Shoah, rescued from Germany as a young man in 1935 by invitation to study at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. It was Rabbi Herman Schaalman, by then a prominent Chicago religious leader and activist, and Dr. LaCocque invited him to come and teach at CTS. They taught often together, developing deep admiration for each other's learning and perspective, and they cultivated an abiding friendship. When Dr. LaCocque and Rabbi Schaalman both retired, their groundbreaking interreligious work lived on. In 2009, matching a $1 million gift from the Pritzker Family Foundation with commitments from a range of donors who understood the transformative impact of a religiously diverse faculty, CTS became the only freestanding Protestant seminary to endow a chair in Jewish studies. That's the chair I sit in, so I'm very grateful. JCIS was revitalized and became a central locus of interreligious leadership in the Chicago area and beyond. It established partnerships with a range of organizations. It sponsored a broad range of lectures and symposia, holy day celebrations, worship, workshops, film series, artistic performances, social justice projects, nurturing deep learning and engagement among people from all religious and non-religious life stances. The world-class scholars and passionate activists, creative programs, and compelling ideas all drew thousands of people to JCIS and to CTS over the years. Then, with a desire to focus more intersectionally across our range of differences, particularly the meeting places of race and religion, and to recognize the limitless diversity of our spiritual life stances, CTS transformed the Center for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies into what we have now, the Interreligious Institute. We continued our cutting-edge work at the meeting place of activism and the academy. So the rabbis of late antiquity taught that one mitzvah leads to the opportunity to do another. So the visionary leadership in interreligious studies and engagement at CTS seeded exciting opportunities to establish our campus as a fertile context for people who orient around religion differently to study together, to shape each other, and thus to prepare individuals who are truly equipped to lead in a religiously plural world. We have students from more than 40 different faith traditions and denominations, as well as secular and interspiritual perspectives. Then beginning in the fall of 2019, that rich that rich diversity has included a transformational partnership with Bayan, a graduate theological institution for Islamic studies that educates men and women to serve as American Muslim leaders. In courses and co-curricular programs where students of diverse life stances learn together, this magical process of co-formation unfolds. Students become more conscious of their own religious particularity and more adept at narrating their journey within it. They gain perspective to view their tradition from outside as well as within, and they dig deep into the core of their traditions, refining their ideas and identities through this sharpening lens of encounter. The conviction that religious leaders need to understand traditions other than their own and to build deep relationship with people of diverse life stances, exemplified by Dr. LaCocque and Rabbi Schaalman. This is integrated into our mission and commitment statement, and it really stands as a testament to their legacy, so I want to share it with you. We're committed in a global context of religious conflicts and a society structured by Christian privilege to joyous embrace of religious diversity, expanding our groundbreaking work in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic studies to advance understanding and collaboration among the rich multiplicity of spiritual traditions and life stances. So we welcome you all to taste the fruits of this work. One of those fruits is that our students are out there doing really exciting things in the world, even before they leave school. So I want to turn it now to Kim Schultz to share with you some of that work.
Thank you, Rabbi Mikva, for that beautiful, beautiful description of where we have been and where we are and where we hope to go in this rich multiplicity, in your words, as you said. I am the creative coordinator. I apologize for not introducing myself at the beginning, of the creative initiatives here at the Interreligious Institute at CTS. And I have the great honor tonight to present the 2023 Schaalman Award to our selected winner, Jamel Garrett. Yay, we can all applaud. Exactly. Congratulations to Jamel. He entered this year with a proposal titled Clutchin' Mama, Big Mama's Quilt, Hoodoo Initiation as a Source of Holistic Healing. And I just want to read just a very, very small bit from the beginning of his proposal. He says, in 2019, as a result of my research in the fields of Africana, history, and religious studies, and sustained introspection, I made a lifelong commitment to hoodoo spiritual development as a primary source of intrapersonal and communal holistic healing. Hoodoo is an Africana revolutionary ancestral culture whose historical development merged the histories of Africa, the Caribbean, the Americas within the political context of the transatlantic slave trade and subsequent domestic enslavement. An indispensable component of hoodoo culture is working the roots. He then goes into much more detail about what that means, working the roots. So through his curiosity, his commitment, exploration, and recognition of the interconnectedness and intersectionality and the rich multiplicity of it and us all, Jamel represents himself the roots of interreligious work that we hope to do at this institution. And we are so grateful and honored that he has chosen us to do it here with. We are thrilled to present the 2023 Schaalman Award to Jamel Garrett. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind words. Thank you for everybody that has gathered. And I will keep my comments brief. And I wrote them because I'm not at the stage yet where I'm comfortable entirely going off the cuff. So bear with me if it sounds a bit forethought of, because it was. And so first and foremost, I would like to give praise to Olodumare, which in Yoruba culture, Olodumare is the spirit of creation. I also would like to give thanks to my Egungun, which translates into ancestors, my living elders, for example, my mother, Joanne Garrett, and Mother Nature, that is the sentient, dynamic, and enfolding worlds that porously vibrate through and around us. Secondly, I would like to thank the families and legacies of Dr. LaCocque and Rabbi Schaalman. Thirdly, I would like to thank the persons who sat on a selection committee for their gracious demonstration of appreciation and confidence. Last but not least, I would like to thank my advisor, Reverend Dr. Lama Terrell, my dissertation committee, as well as the various worlds that make up the CTS community that have in innumerable conscious and subconscious ways molded and remolded my perceptions of myself, others, and our innate possibilities for transformation through transmutation. In the years that I've lived in Chicago and labored in the vineyards of CTS, I've lived several lives, if you will, which for present me underscore the significance of ancestral veneration. Ancestral veneration through my Africana cultural lens has been and will continue to be a process of interpersonal holistic healing that contains a critical but necessary component of awakening within oneself to reverencing and maximizing one's inherent interdependence with the formative elements that have shaped one's being, which includes, but is not limited to, human, non-human, cosmic, and earthly energies and processes. This makes ancestral veneration an inherent process of intra-religious engagement as Christian and non-Christian, African as well as non-African ancestors are, and I put in quotation or parentheses, remembered within one's inner consciousness, within one's inner being. Thank you.
Congratulations, Jamal. Hi, everyone. My name is Haley Hudler, and I am a recent CTS graduate and the manager of donor engagement. I first want to publicly acknowledge the donors, alumni, and board members who have joined the André LaCocque host committee, who have promoted the attendance of today's lecture and encouraged donations to the Interreligious Commitments campaign. The host committee includes Rabbi Sam Gordon, 1996 alumna Jackie Belisle, 1982 alumni Linda and Peter Lucky, and Board of Trustee Zach Shaw. They have all collectively raised together $5,000 for the Interreligious Commitments campaign, and will be matching your gifts to this LaCocque lecture. I want to thank those who have already donated to today's lecture and inspire everyone on this call and watching the recording to make your gift today. I want to quickly share my screen of the progress that we've made on our fundraising for the event. Right now, we have raised $2,557. And if everyone gave $50 today, we will surpass our goal. I am placing the giving page link in the chat so you can take advantage of the host committee's gift match. Thank you all so much for your attendance, and please enjoy the lecture and discussion.
Good evening, everyone. Saigyo was a 12th century Buddhist who at the age of 22 left a life of privilege to become a monk and a poet. He influenced generations with his haiku. Here are two from the collection, Gazing at the Moon. As dew on the grass blade that quivers with each touch, let my heart hold still and unscattered. stilling the turbulent waters of the heart. I wait now for the lotus to open. Now I would like to introduce the person who's going to introduce our speaker, the Reverend Dr. Joanne Terrell.
Thank you, Thomas. Dr. Braxton, Dean Crowder, Dr. Mikva, and other faculty colleagues, to Ms. Schultz and Lisa Zook, to students and all friends of Chicago Theological Seminary. I met the insightful, delightful Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad when I was a guest pastor at a church she attends with her family in Asheville, North Carolina, land of the sky, United Church of Christ, whose pastor is an alumna of Chicago Theological Seminary, Pastor Sarah Ator Wilcox. Dr. Vesely-Flad is Associate Professor of Religion and Philosophy and Director of Peace and Justice Studies at Warren Wilson College in Swannanoa, North Carolina, and Visiting Professor of Buddhism and Black Studies at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. This daughter, mother, spouse, scholar, activist, and longtime practitioner of mindfulness is seeking to give deepened spiritual underpinnings to movements for peace and liberation. She is the author of Racial Purity and Dangerous Bodies, Moral Pollution, Black Lives, and the Struggle for Justice. The André LaCocque Lecture for the Interreligious Institute will cover some themes from her most recent book, Black Buddhists and the Black Radical Tradition, The Practice of Stillness in the Movement for Liberation. Tonight, I am pleased and honored to introduce to some and present to others Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad.
Thank you so much, Dr. Terrell and President Braxton and the organizers and all of you who are with us this evening. It is an incredible honor to be invited to give this lecture. I also want to take a moment to honor the Buddha and our Asian Buddhist lineages, and also to acknowledge and honor Indigenous peoples worldwide, and not least, our own personal ancestors, those who are known to us and those who are unknown, our spiritual ancestors and our biological ancestors. This evening, I am in some ways building off of the book that I published not even a year ago, Black Buddhists and the Black Radical Tradition, and at the same time expanding a set of inquiries that have come to me in the classroom while teaching at Union this year. It's a very provocative environment, and while in Black Buddhists, I was primarily concerned with the emphasis on psychological liberation in the Black radical tradition and how it met and informed Black Buddhists who are practicing in numerous lineages throughout the United States. What has come to me while teaching at Union are questions of how Buddhism speaks to systemic oppression in direct ways. And so actually much of what I will introduce to you tonight is research I have just started to conduct, a set of inquiries that is really challenging and very provocative and enlivening. And this is in large part because we in this country have encountered Buddhism as primarily a tradition of interiority. And it is that. I don't dismiss that in the least. And yet we have, through the model of the historical Buddha and through contemporary Buddhists in other countries, I'm primarily going to highlight India this evening, and also in our own traditions, the Black radical tradition and Black liberation theology, we have so much to acknowledge and to build from, and frankly, to inform Buddhist social ethics in this country, which at this point in time is somewhat underdeveloped and has great room to expand. So that's what I'm going to hone in on over the next 30 or so minutes. So I first want to say that I'm very informed by the work of Dr. James Cone. He was my mentor while I was first an MDiv and then a doctoral student at Union. I was steeped in Black liberation theology. And one thing that I propose that I just pointed to is that I do think that Buddhism, as it is evolving in this particular context, needs to be in conversation with Black studies. And I think it's particularly fruitful if it's in conversation with Black liberation theology, particularly as we examine how Dr. Cone evolved the social gospel tradition, especially analyzing the works of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and how he sought to make relevant a kind of liberal Christianity that really, in many ways, much like I see Buddhism today, as it's practiced in the United States or articulated in the United States, not especially relevant. And yet, Dr. Cone did something path-breaking, and there is room for us to follow in that tradition. And it is also true that new forms of Buddhism are being articulated in ways that are so important for us to understand. And while even now, as I am exploring a certain set of questions and inquiries, I'm learning so much about how there are challenges to systemic oppression that are directly relevant, particularly to systemic racism in this country. So I want to start there at that intersection. What is relevant in these two traditions? And I'll just say, broadly speaking, Black liberation theology and a certain form of Buddhism that I'll refer to as Ambedkarite Buddhism. But even before I launch into that, I want to point to some similarities between the two traditions that highlights the central figures. So in both Buddhism and Christianity, we have a central figure who's considered a founder, whose teachings were written down by disciples, and those teachings were later expanded philosophically. In both of these cases, we have hagiographies of solitary men who went out into the wilderness to meditate and pray, who confronted sinister voices that sought to lead them astray. We have this tale of Jesus of Nazareth, who spent 40 days in the wilderness, during which time he rejected a kind of temptation. And then he went into his public ministry. And we see this in such poetic form in the Gospel of Luke. And also we have this figure of Siddhartha Gotama, who became the Buddha, who spent 7 years practicing austere renunciation before becoming enlightened under the Bodhi tree. And enlightenment in this particular telling means that the Buddha was able to see clearly simply what is, without being encumbered by thoughts or narratives. The telling or the phrase that is often used is that a star was simply a star. There was nothing latent on it. It was no extemporaneous narrative or story, as much as there simply was what it was, and he could see that clearly. Legend tells us that Mara, a tempter, targeted Siddhartha with poisonous arrows, and that Siddhartha, in this story of enlightenment, touched the earth, summoning her support, and turned these arrows into flowers. And then he too, like Jesus of Nazareth, began a public ministry. We're told that at this point, he ventured out and gave his first sermon on the Four Noble Truths, which detail the fact of suffering and then the path of liberation from suffering. So we have, in some interesting ways, parallels between these two founders, according to legend. And we also have the stories that continue to parallel each other. And this is where I think we have something to say when we say, what does it mean to stand against the status quo? We have something to learn, a kind of modeling that is relevant even today. So both of these founders or would-be founders led disciples, right? And in asserting their spiritual teachings, they confronted the religious authorities of their time. Now, you, as members of Chicago Theological Seminary, are steeped in a tradition that teaches you how Jesus of Nazareth confronted religious authorities whom he critiqued on various levels. And also, you are steeped in narratives in which Jesus of Nazareth turns towards the dispossessed and the marginalized in society. So bleeding women, lepers, blind men, tax collectors. We have a kind of similar narrative with Siddhartha Gotama. And what we are told is that after his enlightenment, when he becomes known as the Buddha, that he too confronted religious authorities. He, in this case, confronted Hindu authorities who at this time were invested in a system that is known as the caste system. Siddhartha, throughout his lifetime, was steeped in Hindu doctrines and rites and rituals that governed every aspect of social life. He was born a member of the Sakya clan and was actually born quite wealthy, the son of royalty. But having left all of that, after becoming enlightened, he took Hindu doctrines and expanded them and introduced new doctrines that had tremendous meaning for the social norms he confronted. And in this case, particularly the caste system that governed social life in early India. So the doctrine, and I'll just actually speak somewhat personally at this moment, the doctrine that was most formative, or actually I should say that was new for Siddhartha, now the Buddha, is a doctrine that is translated as not self. The Pali term is anatta. And this is a doctrine that is not found within Hindu scriptures that argues that human beings, like all phenomena that surround us, are impermanent, that we're composed of a body, of feeling tones, of perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. These 5 aspects of the human person are sometimes known as aggregates or heaps. So the 5 aggregates, or although this is somewhat unwieldy, the 5 heaps. The Buddha argued that our sense of a solid self is really an ever-changing set of aggregates that simply seems like a solid self. And I am very aware that this is a very hard notion to grasp. And it's also very difficult to impart just how radical a teaching it was at the time and that it continues to be. So it suggests, one, that we are constantly changing, that we ourselves are impermanent. And it also suggests, and this is where I can speak personally, that there's something radical in the fact that we can cultivate the ways in which we can change. Perhaps most importantly for our theme tonight, what is important to recognize in this doctrine of not self is that it pushed against the caste system that pervaded the South Asian region, the time of the Buddha's life. And that is still in place today. So we have a system in this caste system that is fixed, that is rigid, that is permanent in the eyes of those who uphold it. And yet what the Buddha introduced is a notion or a doctrine of impermanence of the human being, which pushes against the idea that people are located and meant to perform in the caste into which they are born. So there's a kind of impermanence or flexibility that pushes against rigidity. And the Buddha didn't just say this in his teachings, he practiced it in his communities, which is to say that he invited members of every caste to live together, and he invited those who were outside of the caste system, who were known as unclean or impure. The contemporary parlance at sometimes is untouchable. The self-identification for many is Dalit, which is translated as broken. But the Buddha invited all members of all castes to participate in the Sangha and to live together. He did not distinguish between people of different castes, and in fact, paid more attention to the capacity of the practitioner than to the social hierarchy in which they were inserted. And this was radical. The caste system, even today, for many, governs who you can marry. It asserts who you can eat with, where you can live, where you can walk, the kind of well you can drink from, the kind of employment you can gain. And while since 1947, India legally has not instituted or upheld the caste system, socially it's still very much in place. So this was very important, particularly to a scholar named B.R. Ambedkar, who is incredibly bright, born into the Dalit community, who went to Columbia University and achieved a PhD, and then the London School of Economics and achieved yet another PhD. And he returned to India as an anti-caste leader. He wrote prolifically. In 1956, just before his death, he led 500 Dalit Indians to convert from Hinduism to Buddhism. And he did this because he did not see a way forward within the Hindu tradition with the kind of inflexibility he encountered within the caste system, but rather thought Buddhism or upheld Buddhism with its emphasis on impermanence as a kind of liberatory tradition that could give a foundation, give succor, even enlightenment to the Dalit Indians who experienced caste oppression. Ambedkar provides a model for us as we seek in this country to expand Buddhist social ethics, to confront racism, to confront white supremacy and all of its iterations in this particular context. And I see a number of parallels between Ambedkar's analysis and rejection of caste and James Cone's analysis of racism, particularly in his articulation of Black liberation theology. So here's where the traditions speak to each other in my analysis and my interpretation. In 1969, James Cone published Black Theology and Black Power. I do think of this as a parallel text to Ambedkar's speech, which is published as a text, which is called Annihilation of Caste. And what I find so important in both of these texts is that both Cone and Ambedkar take on a religious system, so Christianity and Hinduism respectively, and they analyze and they dig into and shine a light on how these religious systems hold in place seemingly intractable social hierarchies. Of course, here in the United States, Cone argues that the system of white supremacy, which is buttressed by Christianity, governs all aspects of social life. And in India, Ambedkar argued the same thing, that the caste system, undergirded by Hinduism, keeps those outside of the caste system perpetually at the bottom. So they both identified religion and a kind of dominant religious system as keeping in place these systems of oppression that directly affected, in India, the Dalit communities, and in the United States, the Black communities, plural. But each thinker did not stop at analysis, right? They were profoundly insightful and visionary in thinking about the possibilities for new ways of thinking about identity, the identities of those who were systematically at the bottom of the social ladder. Dr. Cone, as you likely know well, did not reject Christianity, but rather sought to evolve it. And I find it so interesting that he brings Malcolm X into the center of it, right? He is he is bringing in a radical thinker steeped in, over the course of his public ministry, different forms of Islam. But what is so important is that Dr. Cone sees a kind of creativity and a kind of directness in Malcolm X's voice and brings that into dialogue with Martin Luther King Jr. and evolves for all of us then the social gospel to speak directly to the plight of Black people in this country. He said Jesus is Black, and as a systematic theologian, he proceeded to take that apart and buttress his argument and systematize it. He adamantly rejected the myopia embedded in liberal theology, even though, of course, he locates Black liberation theology within the tradition of the social gospel. And always Cone's theology was a call to action, that every ounce of Christian privilege must be used to fight against oppression. You know, persistently for Dr. Cone, to call yourself a Christian is to enter the streets and work on behalf of the oppressed. And in his analysis, that always involves Black people. Dr. Ambedkar did not see a way forward within the Hindu tradition, but he was well aware that you couldn't simply change laws. You know, he was actually profoundly influential as the first law minister of India and as the person who led the committee to draft the Indian Constitution. He was profoundly influential in changing laws to impact the well-being of Dalit Indians. And he also saw that religion undergirded how social systems evolved and were perpetuated, and that religion and spirituality had to be a part of supporting and essentially reifying the Dalit community in terms of changing identity, in terms of lifting up self-esteem and collective presence. And so he rejected Hinduism and the rigidity of caste analysis within sacred Hindu texts. He converted to Buddhism, as I mentioned, and again, he was inspired by the Buddha's emphasis on impermanence, on the impermanence of human beings. He identified this rigid caste system as not only socially oppressive, but as philosophically wrong. And he did this as he led this mass conversion to Buddhism just before his death. So I say this because it's compelling to Buddhists facing social oppression in India, and it is compelling to Black Buddhists in this country. So much of what we have to contend with is how Buddhism speaks to conditions of oppression. And there are doctrines within Buddhism, particularly this doctrine on impermanence, and also a doctrine that is sometimes translated as causes and conditions, that speak to why conditions matter and why it's important to address conditions. So this is something that, as a practitioner, as someone who now speaks in Dharma communities, that leads me to think Buddhism is directly relevant, not only to how we might address our own trauma, our own personal suffering, but also how Buddhism leads us to think about its relevance in terms of systemic oppression. As we think of impermanence, and as we hone in on the fact of impermanence, as the Buddha taught throughout his lifetime, it's important to recognize that not recognizing impermanence is considered ignorance within Buddhism, that there's a kind of doctrine that hones in on the root of suffering as ignorance. And so we can think of this as ignorance of the fact of impermanence leads to conditions that perpetuate suffering. So to adopt us or to embrace this teaching on impermanence is itself liberating, and it also leads us to understand how collective widespread suffering can be perpetuated. If we cannot acknowledge this fact of ignorance and the fact of oppressive conditions, we perpetuate them. We see this in writings throughout, I would say, Black America. We see this in the writings of James Baldwin, who said white myopia or ignorance holds white supremacy in place. The importance of acknowledging that, and also then acknowledging why conditions matter and how conditions matter. And Buddhism, even in its kind of unwieldy translations of terms, gives us a way of acknowledging these oppressive conditions. So Ambedkar honed in on this. Dr. Cohn, too, speaking from the Christian tradition, hones in on this, that to address myopia, to embrace impermanence, is key to liberation. And I'll just say that again, to address myopia or ignorance, to also embrace this fact of impermanence is key to liberation. So this is how we might think of it on a systemic level. And what I now want to turn to is the fact that clarity of mind is the underpinning of all of this on an individual level. And then we can also think of this in a collective way. What does it mean to clarify our minds, to settle our minds? And again, I return to the Buddha, the enlightened one, who rejected the caste system by accepting all castes as well as those deemed polluted into the Sangha. And I return to Ambedkar, who identified the caste system, rooted in Hindu sacred texts, as oppressive, and who led 500,000 Dalit Indians to convert to Buddhism. These were figures who sought to clear their minds. And in so doing, in a kind of deep practice, in seeing clearly what is, they were able to take on authorities that insisted upon a rigid status quo. I will say that for me personally, as a Black Buddhist practitioner, that the teachings on conditions matter in part because they speak to my own conditioning. And this was pervasive in the interviews I did for my book on Black Buddhists, that as we take on conditions, we take on the social meanings of the body. The writer Zenju Earthland Manual says, we must come through the fire of our lives to experience awakening. And what she points to is that the very particular aspects of our lives matter so much as we seek to settle, to be awake, to be aware, to be clear in a kind of interior way. Our bodies matter, and the conditions in which we live matter. But as we turn to the particularities of our lives, to our conditions, we also turn to our conditioning. And so I want to assert something that I think is maybe somewhat controversial, even in the institution in which I teach at Union Theological Seminary, which is to say that our liberation does not stop at our acknowledgement or our struggle against oppressive conditions. So often in our activist communities, we focus on what we can do. We deeply empathize. We are deeply sensitive to those who struggle, perhaps even more than we do. We take on the suffering of others when we have the capacity to do so. And this is something Dr. Cohn advocated to the end of his life. Every ounce of privilege should be used in the struggle against oppression. And yet, here is what I want to offer to you about why Buddhism as a practice, as well as a set of doctrines, is so important. That our liberation does not stop at protest or advocacy or dismantling oppressive institutions, as important as all of those actions and commitments are. That we are also compelled to look within ourselves, to take note of how our conditions have led to a kind of inner conditioning that often does not serve us. In this teaching on the impermanence of our persons, we have a very specific teaching on complex mental formations that helps us see how we develop patterns that often are self-oppressive or directed towards those in our immediate environment. These can function like default settings. We often react in a kind of impulsive way, and this reactivity causes harm to ourselves and others. So as we put our privilege to the service of all beings, and especially those who are more oppressed than perhaps we particularly experience, we also have to take time to acknowledge our own lives, what is taking place within and around us, and also to cultivate responses to our conditions and our conditioning that serves us rather than perpetuate suffering. It is what I find most profound in Buddhism, even though I do hone in on these teachings of impermanence and conditions. But it's the fact that we actually can work on ourselves so that as we confront these conditions, we move from reactivity to responsiveness. What I love most about Buddhism is that we have practices on how to observe our bodies, how to observe our breath, how to offer compassion for ourselves and others. We have practices on how to work with grief and rage so that we can tend to our feelings and to our states of mind without projecting them onto other people. I think of these practices as resourcing ourselves so that we function like rooted trees in the midst of a storm. These are practices for healing ourselves, for healing the intergenerational trauma that we carry with us in ourselves, and for healing our families and communities. So fundamentally, frankly, when I think of standing against the status quo, I think of cultivating a way of being that is fundamentally non-reactive. And as activists, that can be hard to hear because it may suggest passivity, but it's actually the opposite of passivity. It's awareness. It requires speaking out, but it also requires embracing silence. And it requires taking time to cultivate a stable inner life. So within the Black liberation tradition, particularly Black liberation theology, and within the Buddhist tradition, we have these profound teachings on how to challenge systemic oppression. And I think particularly within Buddhism, we have practices for how to work on ourselves as we do that, how to acknowledge, how to know, how to practice liberation. And I'll just conclude with one last note, which is about liberating the Black body from harmful historical narratives. This was something that was so deeply important to Dr. James Cone and so deeply important as well to the people I interviewed, the teachers and long-term practitioners I interviewed for my book. For them, Buddhism is a practice of coming back to the body again and again. In these practices of breath meditation and bowing, we attune to the body. We cannot be liberated without the body. And for Black people who are practicing Buddhism, this Black body, which has been historically defiled, becomes a site for liberation. So I'll stop there, and I invite conversation with Dr. Terrell. And thank you again for this invitation.
Thank you so much. I am so delighted to have heard this lecture and have this opportunity to respond to it. So I think that you will articulate the task of providing for this context in which we're living a Buddhist social ethics, because it's severely underdeveloped here, with regards to confronting the structures that we have to contend with, the systemic violence of the penal system, the immigration system, foster care system, racism, white supremacy, all the systemic things that we're constantly having to respond to. And because Buddhism as a practice is severely undeveloped here, and as a mindset, as a way of being in the world, what are some of the reasons you think this is so? Is it because Buddhism inherently does not confront powers? Or what is it about the ways that Buddhism is contextualized here that make the practice non-confrontational?
I think it's the way that Buddhism has, you could say, migrated as a set of doctrines and practices to this country. And it's happened in different ways, according to different, in different lineages. So in my lineage, which now in this particular context is known as the Insight tradition, it was brought over by white practitioners, primarily Jewish, who went to India and to Thailand, Burma, in a couple of cases, and they practiced with teachers. They practiced forms of meditation that they found congruent with their own upbringings. They brought these teachings back and established centers, these kind of enormous, now well-funded meditation centers. In other cases, I'm thinking particularly of specific Zen lineages and Tibetan lineages. Buddhism was brought over by teachers, but their disciples, their students, were mainly white students who were seeking to answer a certain set of questions. And even today, I know this sounds somewhat shocking, but I am one of few Black faculty in this country teaching Buddhism. There is somebody at the University of Pennsylvania who teaches Japanese religions. We have a Stanford graduate with graduating with his PhD this semester, but there are just very few. And if you think about it, like Black children aren't being raised in Buddhist sanghas. There are actually very few sanghas that really cater to families and to children. Whereas if you think of the Black church and what it has meant for Black families, for Black communities, just thinking about Dr. Cohn and his biography, it makes sense that you would have this within the Christian tradition. Just thinking about the Black church during enslavement and the institutionalization. And so you kind of have people come up through the Black church, but with particular experiences so that they're seeking to make the Christian tradition relevant. And we don't have that within Buddhism. We have a kind of dearth. We actually, just in the past few years, have started to have a kind of visibility of Black teachers and practitioners. And you, of course, are one, but there are so few. I think there are less than 100 in the country. And I, at this point, know almost everyone, having done this field research over a number of years. So I think it's that when people enter the academy, they come in with questions that are directly relevant to them personally. And we haven't had that within Buddhist studies, so that there is a kind of dearth that very gradually, I think, people are paying attention to.
I think that dearth can also be related to the ways in which individualism is the kind of root philosophical ideal of this country. So everything gets contextualized as individualism, in Christianity included, as an individualistic philosophical grounding. So, and I think Buddhism is not individualistic in its original context. It promotes sangha, It promotes compassionate connection to all beings. And so this individualism philosophy has something to do, I think, with the ways in which Buddhism is contextualized here. So
yeah, I really agree with you. And I have a friend who is a Dharma teacher. Her name is Sebede Selassie. She wrote a book actually called You Belong. And she teaches Dharma classes entitled What Got Left Out, and basically argues, and actually I quote her in my book saying this, she says, we took a yang practice that was in a yin social context. You know, there were children everywhere and families everywhere. And, you know, there would be monastic communities, but supported by families. And she said, we took that yang practice and dropped it into a yang culture, which is what you're pointing to, right? Like this sense of, you know, solitude. And she said, you know, it's not like that in countries in which Buddhism is a majority religion. But in this, you know, Buddhism maps onto the cultures it encounters. And this is true historically, and it's also true in this particular context. And yet, I think I do see that things are changing.
And when it comes to the parallel ministries of the Buddha and Jesus, I think you might agree with me that the inner piety that they critiqued, that is associated with them, is actually in large part a projection onto them. In the Buddha's case, by ignoring the minimal impact that he himself had on changing the caste system, and Buddhism had to flourish outside of India. And then, although, you know, the critique certainly took root, it just wasn't able to overcome the total immersion in Hindutva. So I think the inner piety is a projection onto him, but I also think it's a projection onto Jesus by the constrained views of evangelicalism and the philosophy of individualism in which American nationalism was shaped. But is inner piety really what Jesus and the Buddha actually practiced? I know that they practiced contemplation, or if it is the case that it was inner piety that is what they were about, how did they practice it in conjunction with their decidedly great compassion towards the dispossessed and the marginalized in society?
Well, I do think there is a kind of, in both cases, knowing what we know, right? Just the narratives that have been given to us, written down, you know, many years, if not hundreds of years after their deaths. But I do think in both cases, we see this at least in the Synoptic Gospels and in the hagiography of the Buddha, that there was an orientation towards what I'll call interiority. I think that we especially see this with Jesus in the 3 years of his public ministry, in which he would frequently withdraw to pray. So I think there's something really important in telling about that kind of balancing and a kind of inner authority. I guess when I think of inner piety, and of course I'm very shaped by James Baldwin, I think of the cultivation of inner authority, the capacity to say, no, you know, I'm not going there, or no, I reject that kind of false construct, or, you know, the idea that a kind of, you know, external riches or external power will actually be an end result in and of itself. So in terms of what we know, I do think that there's something within both narratives that emphasizes that, but not to the exclusion of confronting structural oppression. And often what we're told about this figure of the Buddha is that he formed these monasteries and he said, clear your minds, attain enlightenment, or, some kind of version of that. But what he actually did in terms of forming these early communities was very radical in the time in which he lived. So I pay attention to that. And I actually think this kind of inner authority, what James Baldwin would call an unshakable authority, which I see in these hagiographies of these founders, leads to the capacity to stand against this kind of status quo. That's what I'm after. If you were to say, fundamentally, what am I about? I would say that's what I'm about. I think there's something so powerful, but it does require cultivation. And in some cases, it does require retreat, not indefinitely, but a kind of resourcing.
Mm-hmm. I definitely like inner authority better than inner piety.
I understand that. Yeah, I don't actually. I don't use the word piety, but authority does resonate with me too.
Because it's important to recognize in James Cone's instance that even though he did evolve the social gospel, as you say, there is still the necessity of recognizing the importance of liberalism and neo-orthodoxy in his educational formation and in the context of the churches that he engaged. The neo-orthodoxy of the Black church, the liberalism of Paul Tillich that influenced his method of correlation, all of that. So he is fully a Christian theologian, not
so.
just social gospel, but very much liberal and neo-orthodox too, because as he said, I don't want to be a part of any revolution that my mother can't be a part of. Black churches are very neo-orthodox in their leaning and even fundamentalist in some ways, and which is why James Cone had great success in the academy and a little lesser success in the churches.
Mm-hmm.
I think
right. Raphael and Warnock wrote his dissertation on that particular question.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right.
So they both had an eye to social transformation. And I think that's very important. Thank you so much for that. I also wanted to ask you about the doctrine of anatta, not self.
Mm.
So what relationship does the concept of anatta have with Jesus's doctrine of self-denial? Except a person deny self and follow me, you cannot receive the kingdom of God. Or what was the potential for the abuse of the concept of anatta within the Buddhist context, as it is certainly used to elicit self-denial for marginalized people, such as women and slaves in the first century and during the American slaveocracy? What's the potential for the abuse of that concept in the Buddhist context and then in Jesus's context when we talk about self-denial?
Well, that's a big question. I haven't answered in quite the way that you've posed, but I have thought a lot about it and have written both an article and then devoted a good bit of my research for Black Buddhists to this question of really what it means or how it's received, because it does suggest non-personhood. And of course, for people whose ancestors were considered 3/5 of a human being, that does not fly. That does not resonate. So actually, when I first started off my research, before I evolved the book, I was primarily interested in how this idea, this doctrine might be received, but also how it could be articulated in a way that's deeply meaningful. So I think from the top down that anatta could be used in a kind of, let's say, abusive way to suggest non-personhood, although I have never read that or heard that interpretation, but I have honed in on its liberatory aspects and the idea that if you can turn towards this fact of basic impermanence, you can also see that you have the capacity to change ways in which you turn to your own habitual formation. You can cultivate compassion. You can develop a deeper consciousness. So I have not heard it used in a kind of abusive way, but I think it is hard to, it has to be contextualized in certain ways in order for it to resonate. You know, I have never actually thought of this question of self-denial in relation to anatta. I think that's a really provocative question, but it does suggest in both cases a kind of orientation towards embracing selflessness, for lack of a better term, like a kind of capacity, if you will, to not hold on so tightly to a kind of reified notion of identity. And, you know, I quoted Zenju Earthland Manual in my talk just now. And one of the things that she and so many others that I interviewed have said is you need to have a strong sense of identity before you can let it go. And I think that is so true. And so Jesus saying that, you know, deny your parents, deny yourself and follow me, does suggest that on some level he recognizes this capacity to let go, and to, in Mahayana Buddhism, it would be called emptiness, to kind of achieve a kind of inner emptiness. But they have to coexist. And if we had time, we could get into another doctrine, a Mahayana doctrine known as the two truths, and which could really hold those two in balance, those two perspectives in balance. But I think both leaders, as we know their teachings, do suggest that human beings have the capacity to develop, I'll just say, because we both like this phrase, inner authority. And part of that rests upon a kind of groundlessness or a kind of emptiness that I think is quite beautiful and also extremely difficult to live into.
So from your argument, I can see how not self pushes against the caste system, in that ascribed characteristics of a caste, particularly a lower caste, and certainly for the Dalit subcaste, can be repudiated. You know, the ascriptions can be repudiated. Is there, in the Buddhist conceptualization, a positive affirmation of selfness, such as found in Dr. Cohn's conceptualization of somebodyness, or as found in the womanist ideal of self-love regardless? Both those terms and the ideal with which marginalized people can empower themselves. Is there a way in which Buddhism allows marginalized people to empower themselves by a sense of themselves?
Yes, and so it's not found in early Buddhism. There, which is known as the most conservative iteration, if you will, the Buddhism that's practiced in Southeast Asia, and the suttas followed are the suttas of the Pali Canon. There's a fairly stark distinction between monastics and lay people. And as Buddhism evolved, we have what's called the turning of the wheel, Mahayana Buddhism. And within Mahayana Buddhism, there is a doctrine known as two truths. And in two truths, there is an emphasis on everyday life, and also an emphasis, or what might be called mundane life, and an emphasis on ultimate experience. So a kind of mundane truth and an ultimate truth. And what many Mahayana sutras and contemporary teachers as well will say is that you have to affirm and know intimately, to turn towards and know intimately this mundane life. You could say pass through it or live through it, but not avoid it, not reject it, not repress it, not deny it, not disavow it, but live through it and know it fully. And in so doing, you can touch upon ultimate reality or ultimate truth. I do think within the Mahayana tradition, there's much more acknowledgement, if you will, of, let's say, identity, but correspondingly an emphasis on what's translated as emptiness. The term is shunyata. But yes, and you may be familiar with this in your own practice. So what I will say, though, in terms of interviewing Black Buddhists of numerous lineages, including the Theravada lineage, is that this emphasis on compassion, which you find also in early suttas, you certainly find this in the Mahayana tradition, you certainly find it in the Tibetan tradition or in the Vajrayana tradition more broadly, that this emphasis on compassion does take into account loving kindness and how we relate to each other. And we start with ourselves, as we are non-self, we are on some level, we are, it's not that we're not a self, it's that we're not a permanent, non-changing self. And so this capacity to offer compassion, starting with yourself, is central to all of these different iterations of Buddhism. And it does, thinking about the womanist tradition, it does suggest that self-care, self-compassion is central to how we relate to one another, and how we nourish ourselves, how we cultivate a kind of worldview that's deeply beneficial to ourselves as well as others.
So lastly, Dr. Cohn calls for a very radical thing, for white people to become ontologically Black. Is there a similar call in the Buddhist tradition to others to become ontologically Dalit, ontologically Muslim, ontologically Christian? And would doing these things en masse lead inexorably towards a Buddhist social ethics that we do not see in the American context, nor in Myanmar, for an example?
Well, I will be honest and say I have just started this inquiry into Ambedkar, and I'm not deeply steeped in all of his texts. He was not the first to suggest Buddhism as an alternative to Hinduism, but he was maybe the most prolific, and he is the person I think of when you ask this question. I have not seen that in any kind of Buddhist social ethics. Primarily, the Buddhist social ethics that have been articulated and that are more expansive are in Asian countries that have experienced longstanding warfare, deforestation. I'm thinking now of leaders such as the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh, people who wrote prolifically and lived in exile, and there are many others. There are Buddhist scholars in Asian countries that are looking specifically at those conditions. But I will say, not identity in the way that you're pointing to. I think in this particular context, because of the history of the United States in particular, the ways in which identities are formed, the ways in which identification is enacted upon people, the kind of oppression that lies within this kind of social stratification. Certainly, it is true in India in the caste system, but because I'm not far enough along in my research on Ambedkar in particular, or members of his intellectual community to know exactly how that has happened. And I have not seen that in Buddhist social ethics in other countries. I can't directly answer that. What I would say, this is maybe more prescriptive than anything that I have encountered, but more in my research for the Black Buddhists book, is that the call is to heal intergenerational trauma. The call is to embrace the Black body, but not so much to become the most oppressed. The call is really to turn towards our own suffering, to know it intimately, and on some level to be able to heal from that. And on some level too, I think the call is to transcend these identities and forms of identification, even as we claim them, the kind of both and, to hold those in tension. A friend of mine who is on this call sent me a note saying that she's done quite a bit of research on Ambedkar. In her reading, the call is to castelessness, but not to become, say, identified with Dalit Indians. That said, I think we have to be very nuanced and not lead into, say, a kind of color blindedness in this particular context. So these are very complicated questions. But I primarily want to highlight that even as I do see that Buddhism in these particular doctrines, which can be expanded, and these particular role models we can uphold, I do think there are radical ways of thinking and being that fundamentally, I see it as not only a set of doctrines, but a set of practices that does lead to a kind of inner liberation that is also very communally oriented, that is collectively oriented. And that involves some of the hard inner work of turning towards our suffering.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture and a wonderful discussion. And at this time, I'd like to open the floor for questions. There are some already formed in the chat, and I'll start with those. And then if you have other questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. So the first question that came up in the chat is a layered one. It asks, how might the Buddhist insights about impermanence resource us today in constructive engagement with those who do not understand fully their role in systemic oppression? Might there be a grace possible when we resist essentializing those we might rigidify as enemies of justice?
So the way I hear this, but please correct me, is if we can create some kind of spaciousness around those who are, let's say, inflexible or rigid. If we can, this is how I hear the word grace, can we maybe approach those in positions of power differently?
I think that is a good analysis of that question.
Or how might impermanence resource us?
To be empowered differently and to empower those who are coming along, or who may resist coming along alongside of us in the struggle for human liberation.
I know that this is a hard thing to hear. I will say I mentioned this to a group of students, Buddhist students at Union early on before classes started last semester, and I got quite a bit of, let's just say, inquiry, in some cases challenge. But I don't want to suggest that the struggle is not immediate. That, I mean, we need to be, I mean, just some of the forms of oppression we're confronting today it is immediate. And some of my work in the penal system, now over 2 decades, it seems intractable. And yet, what I want to suggest with impermanence, with the doctrine of impermanence as activists, is that we take the long approach. I think, and by this, I mean, and I know it's not a popular thing to say or hear, but these systems are long-standing. You know, if we follow in the analyses of people like Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, Louis Lequant, you know, they have identified, I'm using the prison system as an example, our present day penal system as a form that is rooted in Jim Crow segregation, that is rooted in 100 years of segregation in the South and de facto segregation in the North, and of course, 240 years of enslavement. We are talking centuries, and we now have this new form, and so many of us take it on, and it's urgent. It is urgent, but we take it on as though it has to be dismantled tomorrow. And what I want to suggest is that we take a long approach and know that if we can work steadily and not go through cycles of burnout as activists, as people who are confronting these seemingly intractable systems, that we have much more opportunity to sustain and maybe even anticipate the new forms of how racism is institutionalized in this country. So it is to say that I think impermanence allows us some flexibility and a way of approaching these systems that leads us to say it won't be forever. How can we be wise? How can we sustain? How can we resource ourselves? How can we do this in a way that allows us to be supported for the long haul struggle? Because it is a long haul struggle. I know that that's not a very satisfactory answer. And yet, as someone who's gone through cycles of burnout, at this point, I stand behind it, even though I get pushback.
So the next question is directed to me, but I'd like to punt it to you, and maybe I'll address it after you do. And the question is, what is the difference in your mind between contemplation and inner piety?
Well, this is not maybe a dictionary definition, but I think of inner piety as like following a set of rules. And perhaps that's not accurate, but that's what comes to mind when I hear that. A sincere following of a set of rules. I think of, for example, monastics who take vows and who go inward, who withdraw, but who are within settings in which they are taking vows and following rules. And I think of contemplation as observation, being able to see what comes up clearly, the ability to step back and to simply watch without judgment, but not necessarily within a context of taking vows and following rules. So that's a distinction that comes up for me. What about you?
So as a Buddhist and fundamentally, which is fundamentally humanist, and as a Christian, which is fundamentally theist, I have a kind of different take on inner piety. I don't like the word piety at all. I don't like that word at all, because who is it for? It's not for God who knows you. If it's for people outside, then you're walking humbly before people and not before God. So I don't like the word piety. I even have inner irreverence that I share with the God in me. You know, I have inner irreverence, and we have fun together. Maybe that's part of my contemplative nature, that I've so gone inwardly that I've shed some ideas of myself as I am supposed to be, and just become free to express my inner irreverence, my inner devotion, my inner goodwill for the whole entire cosmos. So piety doesn't doesn't resonate at all for me. But contemplation, I'm not contemplating anything outside of myself. I'm contemplating what's going on inside of myself. And that's part of my Buddhist and Christian merger that makes me whole. So I think that's what I can say. So I don't know if that answers either, but that's how it is with me. Our next question says, was addressed to me again, what does ontologically become the other mean? And I guess I can answer that a bit. It doesn't mean to culturally appropriate Blackness or Islam or Buddhism, or culturally appropriate anything. It does mean to always prepare yourself to take the way with the most despised, whoever they are, to become ontologically LGBTQIA, to become ontologically Black. Even some Black people need to become ontologically Black, to always, to every time take the way with the most despised. That's what that means to me. So if you want to answer that question, you go ahead too. What does ontologically become Black mean, or become anything mean to you?
Yeah, it's a sense of being. When you asked the question earlier, it was for me a question of identifying with, not identification of, but identifying with, and attempting to walk in the shoes of the person who is the most despised or the most oppressed, because of their social identity and because of the ways in which their social identities are constructed.
Let's see. Okay, let's see. So there's a remark here. Heard the phrase trauma bonding recently. Resonated with me to be attentive to its risks. So the question is, what are the risks of trauma bonding?
I think that it is important, and I will say that it was a question I never asked, but it came up in more than half of my interviews for my book. I think it is important to recognize how many people in this context, turn to Buddhism as a result of trauma. And they are seeking ways to work with their trauma, and often it's intergenerational trauma. I never asked this question, but it came up over and over and over. And what I think is actually so helpful, not to say that Buddhism replaces, like, for example, psychological help through therapy or, something to that effect. But I do think Buddhism offers practices of compassion, of just knowing what's coming up in ways that can be really fruitful. I think when people take their trauma and bond through it, that it can be a kind of avoidance of working with their let's say, the patterning that I was mentioning in my talk, the kind of habitual formations that result as part of the experience of trauma. And so the hope is that rather than seeking to bond out of trauma and maybe using that relationship or set of relationships as a way to work with trauma, that we learn to turn towards it. And a friend of mine, Kate Johnson, she actually wrote a book on this, but, you know, really to befriend ourselves so that we're not really always acting out of our trauma and forming relationships out of that. It's not to say it's not part of relationships, but to make that the center of relationships, I think, can be a form of avoidance.
Someone was impressed with your statement that we should transcend these identities and still claim them. And
both and.
Yes, it's well, it's like James Cone asked, how do I remain Black and Christian? And you have to work through that. There's work to do to be able to do that. So I think that's awesome. Would you like to respond to that person?
Yeah, you know, I do think that some of the more complicated work of cultivating a practice is both being able to, for example, see the beauty of the Black body and, you know, thinking of people of African descent, or, you know, any way in which you show up in the world, to be able to actually see your form and really value it, and also not hold onto it so tightly that you can't drop out of narratives that have been constructed about it, or that we ourselves may construct about it. So practice, I don't always know how to put this into words, but practice for me is both turning towards my own life with such great intimacy that I can stay with whatever comes up, including tremendous pain. And it is being able to see what comes up and to let it go, and do that so often that what is beneath all of that thinking, those narratives, you know, the stories, the questions, the conflicts, beneath all of that is this tremendous silence. And the experience of that, even 2 seconds of that, a minute of that, 2 minutes of that, I can't even impress just how profoundly beautiful and tremendously liberating it is to have a clear mind, or to have a mind to let go of the thinking, to transcend the thinking. And so that's some of what I was getting at. It's working with what we've been given, working with what confronts us. And also in practice, it's going beneath that and not being attached to that. So it's a kind of both and. It's a kind of affirmation or claiming, but it's also not being so attached to all that we claim that we can't go beneath it. And the beauty of practice, it's very repetitive, but when we can practice in a kind of sustained way, we can actually move beneath these reified identities. And that is so incredibly powerful. It's beyond words, really.
Yes, I agree. Dr. Morales has said that he loves the teaching, that it is through the everydayness that we seek the ultimate. And it rings similarly to the mujerista notion of lo cotidiano. And I love that too. That especially in this context, you don't have to renounce your family, you don't have to renounce your job. You take on the task of being Buddhist in your everydayness, and learning the ways of the Buddha in your everydayness. So
yes.
And I mean, someone said, if you're not Black, you really can't feel or experience what it means to be Black unless you have spent a lot of time meditating, having Christ in you, having Buddha in you through long years of meditation, tapasaya, and purification. And I don't think that's what Dr. Cone meant. I think he meant developing a sense of the most profound empathy with the marginalized, whoever they are. Empathy that moves you to action and not just feeling either defeated by the vastness of the problem or feeling defeated by the difficulty of denying your own privilege, if that's the case. It's not, I think that sometimes our resistance is as much a part of our conditioning, our conditioned existence that says that we don't want to be ontologically Black. We don't want to be ontologically the other. We want to experience ourselves as privileged relative to others. I'm not saying that's true of the person who sent me that message. I'm just saying that is part of the way in which we deny our responsibility to change the world, change the world in which we live. And I hope that that we can see our way into the most compassionate responses to everyone we meet, whoever we meet, wherever they are. If there are other questions, I'd like to take them now.
Can I respond to that last comment? Oh, and then I think we're gonna. I do have the sense in my own practice that in cultivating self-compassion, in cultivating a kind of inner tenderness, that response to Dr. Cone's call to become ontologically Black or to resonate with the most despised, that we have these practices of how to actually do it. It's not conceptual, but it's actually a much deeper heart response. And I'm sorry, I think I cut somebody off.
No, Dr. Terrell and Dr. Vesely-Flad. My name is Howard Wiley, and I want to thank you first for the lecture and for the conversation between the both of you, and for the input that everyone is making to this conversation. I want to affirm your point about the long haul. I mean, out of the experience of struggle. And I think, we use different terms in different generations, but I remember there was a time when we talked about protracted struggle. And protracted struggle meant that we were in this for the long haul. And I think the danger that we need to recognize is falling into the trap of dualistic thinking, where we make a strict dichotomy between the outer life, outer forms of oppression, and the impact that forms of oppression has on our spiritual life and our inner life. And we don't want to, I think, fall into the trap of making those things disconnected. Our inner life and our outer life, the outward forms of oppression and the inner forms of oppression are deeply connected, which means that our struggle to transform the outer forms of oppression has to be directly connected to our inner transformation. And what the reason why I want to say that is to say that the vital importance of the critical self-reflection and the deep inner work that we do is important with regard to how we internalize forms of oppression. And we have to critically examine the ways that contributes to our participation in our own oppression and the oppression of others. So that inner work is really important on that level. And then on the other level, in terms of protracted struggle, how we sustain struggle over time from one generation to the next, it has to be, we are not able to sustain struggle without some spiritual anchor. We will burn out. We will disconnect. We won't be able to pass the lessons on. And you'll find one generation repeating the struggles of the last generation. And the cycle continues in terms of the forms of struggle that we engage in, but we're actually changing and making a transformation that's going to allow us to move to a different stage of liberation. That's the second point. The third point I want to make is that if we don't do that work, then we will find ourselves in a position of actually perpetuating the forms of struggle that we're trying to liberate ourselves, the forms of oppression that we're trying to liberate ourselves from.
Thank you, Howard. I really deeply appreciate that that warning going forth, because it is not a dualism that we need to be giving any traction, because well, I mean, I think that's how I myself came to the Buddhist faith as a Christian, just finding a way to have my my inner life match my outer commitments to the liberation of folk. I needed to be free too. I needed to be free from my attachments to my own pain. I needed to be free from pain itself, the pain of the trauma itself that I've experienced in life. And I found it in a visionary experience with the Buddha smiling on me. And I'm thinking to myself, well, why is the Buddha smiling on me in this vision I'm having? And then I said to myself, because of some residual evangelicalism, well, Jesus has already secured my salvation, so I might as well figure out how to get enlightened. So that is actually in response to a question that was asked to me. That's how I came to be both Buddhist and Christian, and to claim multiple religious belonging, and there's more besides those two, because I'm not dichotomized. I'm not splintered. I am whole through the various wisdom traditions that sustain me, that I had to go inward to be able to apply to myself, and to be able to reckon, to begin the process of reckoning how it relates to the prospect of liberation and flourishing of humankind. I don't know how much time we have left, but it's not much. But Dr. Vesely-Flad, do you want to respond to Howard's?
I do, and I especially, Howard, want to say first, thank you. That was so evocative and well stated. And your second point in particular about inner liberation, working with the narratives, I mean, that is what I wrote in this book I published last April, which was that there are ways to deconstruct these narratives. And it is, yes, it is central to the Black radical tradition that we have to liberate ourselves psychologically. It is not separate from liberating ourselves politically or economically. It is not separate in any way, shape, or form. And we have centuries of Black thinkers who assert that. And what I point to, I mean, I actually point to some of what I said around activism in the conclusion, but that in that work of psychological liberation, that inner work that is not separate from the outer work, we need practices. We need the how-to, like, okay, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to liberate myself psychologically. How do I actually do that? And it's not, at least I'll just say this personally, but I think this is true for many. It's not a belief system. It's an actual practice of seeing and letting go, seeing and letting go. Seeing what comes up, recognizing the impermanence of it, just over and over for years. It took me 2 years to settle my mind, 2 years to get that 1 second of the narrative dropping, a long time to just every day, every week, I would do these 10 hours as Zenkai, said, just trying to work with what's there. But these practices were taught, and there are many, 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 many different lineages, different traditions. These practices give us that how-to that's so central to this quest, this commitment to psychological liberation. And you are absolutely right. It is not separate from political liberation. It is integral to this long haul struggle. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
I just want to make one more point. I think also your point about clarity of mind is really important right now, and the work that it takes to achieve that. Because one of the things in terms of engaging in struggles for transformation, we really have to understand what we're up against. Really have to see what it is, because these forms of oppression are constantly morphing. They're changing. Right. They're manifesting themselves in different ways, and we can't struggle against one form of oppression if it's a form of oppression that no longer exists in that form. And we have to see the forms and the changing and the way in which these forms of oppression are manifesting themselves in our inner and our outer life. And so that requires clarity. It requires clarity of mind. It requires spiritual discernment. So it requires work on all levels to really understand what it is that we're up against, because it is happening on all levels. So at that point about, I'm trying to really emphasize the practical aspect of what you're saying, if you're engaged in day-to-day struggle.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we have had a wonderful conversation. We've heard a wonderful lecture, and we are blessed that Dr. Vesely-Flad has been with us on tonight. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Very much. Dr. Braxton.
Thank you. I know the entire CTS family wants to thank Dr. Vesely-Flad for this provocative lecture, and Dr. Joanne Terrell for facilitating such a soul-stirring dialogue. Both of you tonight have demonstrated, and the entire community in joining with you, what radical work looks and feels like. With patience and care tonight, we have burrowed beneath the surface and the superficial to the root causes of oppression and the problem of ignorance. And Dr. Vesely-Flad, thank you in particular for tilling both the soil and our souls. And now may there be an abundant harvest of clarity of mind, inner discernment, and responsiveness that will liberate us from an oppressive status quo and cultivate healing. We should all be glad about the truth of impermanence, because if you are like me, the experience this evening has surely transformed us for the better. Have a good evening.